My parents forged the deed to my $4.2 million estate and came with movers to evict me. They had no idea the police were waiting inside. My parents forged a property deed and actually showed up with a moving crew to kick me out of my own $4.2 million estate. The funny part was they had absolutely no clue that my attorney and several police officers were already sitting in the kitchen waiting for them to make their move. Hey, Reddit. Picture this for a minute. You spend your whole life believing family is supposed to mean something. Then one day, the same parents who barely bothered to raise you show up at your front door wearing smug smiles, convinced they've successfully stolen the entire $4.2 million inheritance your grandparents left behind for you. They look you straight in the eye, hand over a stack of papers, and confidently announce that you'll be out of the house by Friday. But nothing compares to the expression on their faces when they came back with the movers and realized who was actually waiting inside. The panic that instantly replaced their confidence was something I'll never forget. It was absolutely priceless. My name is Daniel. I'm 31 years old and I work as a financial analyst. Never in my life did I imagine I'd end up fighting my own family over everything my grandparents spent decades building. After graduating with my finance degree, the very first thing I focused on was making sure their $4.2 million estate was protected so well that nobody would ever be able to get their hands on it. I wanted every legal safeguard possible in place. Why was I so determined? Because I'd spent the previous 22 years watching the vultures circle overhead. Those vultures were my mother, my father, and my younger sister. If you really want to understand why I took such extreme precautions, you need to know the entire story first. This isn't just about a fortune or a beautiful historic home. It's about 25 years of manipulation, non-stop entitlement, and watching the people who should have loved me treat the kindest couple I've ever known like they were nothing more than an endless ATM. So grab yourself a drink and get comfortable because this story takes a very ugly turn. When I was 7 years old, my grandparents, Edward and Margaret Whitmore, became the people who truly raised me. My biological parents, Gregory and Diane, practically dumped me on their doorstep in Baltimore so they could chase what they claimed were incredible career opportunities in Arizona. At least that's the excuse they gave everyone. The truth was much simpler. They wanted a life without the responsibility of raising a child, and they spent years jumping from one get-rich-quick scheme to the next, convinced each new opportunity would finally make them rich. Every single one of those plans failed miserably. Even now, I can still remember the day they left me like it happened yesterday. I was just 7 years old, standing on the brick walkway outside my grandparents' house with a worn-out little suitcase in one hand and my stuffed golden retriever in the other. My dad, Gregory, kept impatiently tapping his foot while checking his watch every few seconds. My mom, Diane, put on a dramatic performance, pretending to cry loudly enough for the neighbors to notice. They kept repeating the same empty promise over and over. It's only temporary, buddy. Just until we get settled into our new executive jobs. Those so-called executive jobs ended up being the sale of imported, unregulated health supplements through what eventually collapsed into a massive pyramid scheme. Within 9 months, they had lost everything they had. By that point, though, my life had already changed for the better. I had settled into my grandparents' home, and before long, calling them Grandpa and Grandma came naturally. In just a short time, they gave me more love, stability, and security than my biological parents ever had. The house itself wasn't just any ordinary home. It was a breathtaking brownstone built in the early 1900s, located in one of Baltimore's historic neighborhoods. It still had its original mahogany woodwork, enormous stained glass windows lining the staircase, and an incredible library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves connected by one of those old rolling ladders you usually only see in movies. Grandpa Edward's family had owned that house for generations. His grandfather, a successful maritime businessman, had built it, and every generation after that took incredible care of it before passing it along. But the brownstone was only part of what they owned. They also had several rental properties, including a beautiful townhouse in Newton and a large triple-decker in Medford. Grandpa bought both properties back in the late 1980s when real estate prices were nothing like they are today. He personally restored every inch of those buildings with his own hands before renting them to working-class families and graduate students at prices people could actually afford. He wasn't the kind of landlord who tried squeezing every dollar out of his tenants. He believed in earning a steady, reliable income while giving decent people a fair place to live. Today, those rental properties alone are worth roughly $1.6 million. Then there were Grandpa Edward's investments. He spent 35 years working as an actuary for a major insurance company. He lived a simple life, drove the same 12-year-old sedan for years, and saved every dollar he could. His investment portfolio was built around index funds, municipal bonds, and dependable blue-chip stocks. There was no Bitcoin, no risky day trading, and nothing flashy designed to impress people. He believed in patient, steady growth, and it paid off. By the time I was a senior in high school, I learned his investment portfolio alone was worth more than $1.5 million. Once you added the brownstone and the rest of the real estate, the entire estate came to roughly $4.2 million. That's a life-changing amount of money for anyone. But honestly, the money itself was never what mattered most to me. That brownstone wasn't just another valuable piece of property. To me, it was home. The biggest thing I gained in that house wasn't the inheritance. It was learning what unconditional love actually felt like. Every morning, I'd wake up to the smell of Grandma Margaret's fresh coffee and whatever she had baking in the kitchen. Tuesdays always meant blueberry scones. Fridays were reserved for warm cinnamon rolls. Sundays belonged to her homemade sourdough pancakes. She never broke that routine. Before I'd even decided to study finance, she'd call upstairs every morning. "Rise and shine, my little calculator." She started calling me that when I was 9, after I spent an entire Saturday organizing my Pokemon cards by their hit point ratios and attack stats instead of actually playing with them. Grandpa Edward taught me how to play chess in the library. Even though I was an energetic kid who constantly knocked pieces off the board, he never lost his patience. Every time I'd make a careless move, he'd calmly reset the board and smile. "Risk assessment, Daniel," he'd remind me. "Always think 4 moves ahead. Figure out what the other person wants before they do. Protect your king, and never rush. People who rush usually end up losing." Looking back, I realize he wasn't just teaching me chess. He was teaching me how to live. Sunday dinners were another tradition that never changed. Grandma would prepare huge roast dinners, and we'd spend hours around the long dining room table talking about everything imaginable. We'd discuss history, local politics, whatever I happened to be learning in school, and anything else that crossed our minds. They never treated me like I was just a kid whose opinions didn't matter. They actually listened to what I had to say, asked questions, and made me feel like my thoughts had value. More than anything else, they taught me what honesty meant. Grandpa used to tell me, "A man's reputation is the only currency that really matters, Daniel. Once you spend it recklessly and lose it, you'll never earn all of it back." Those words stayed with me for the rest of my life. Meanwhile, my relationship with my biological parents and my younger sister Sophie was a completely different story. It was toxic from beginning to end. They'd only show up once or twice a year, usually around Christmas when expensive gifts were expected, or sometime during the summer whenever they'd run out of money and needed another bailout. By the time I turned 11, I could practically predict every step of their routine. A few days before one of my Little League games, my dad would suddenly become the world's most enthusiastic father, calling nonstop and pretending he'd been deeply involved in my life the whole time. Then they'd finally arrive. First came the over-the-top hugs and fake excitement. Next came the empty compliments about how much I'd grown. After that, they'd casually wander through the house, making comments about how valuable the brownstone had become, or asking suspiciously innocent questions about Grandpa's investments. Finally came the main event, the desperate sales pitch. There was always some emergency that required money immediately. The transmission had supposedly gone out on Dad's latest BMW. Mom claimed her chronic migraines had created enormous medical bills, even though those headaches somehow disappeared whenever she was out drinking wine with friends. Sometimes it was an exclusive investment opportunity in luxury timeshares. Other times it was some revolutionary business venture that only needed another $15,000 to turn them into millionaires overnight. Every visit followed the exact same script. There was always another crisis, another unbelievable opportunity, and another promise that they'd pay everything back soon. They never repaid a single dollar, not once in 25 years. I still remember one Thanksgiving when I was 15. Dad cornered Grandpa in the kitchen while everyone else was waiting for dinner and begged him for $9,500 to invest in what he called a groundbreaking cryptocurrency mining company. "This is the one, Edward," he kept saying. "This is generational wealth." Grandpa stood there quietly while Dad sweated through his cheap dress shirt trying to convince him. Eventually, Grandpa wrote him a check for $5,000, mostly because he wanted him to leave so the rest of us could finally enjoy Thanksgiving dinner in peace. 7 months later, the founders of that company were charged by the SEC with wire fraud. Dad never mentioned the investment again. Later, I asked Grandpa why he'd given him the money when he clearly knew it was a terrible idea. He let out a long sigh and suddenly looked years older than he had that morning. Then he looked at me and said something I'll never forget. "Sometimes, Daniel, the money is worth spending if it shows you exactly who someone really is." Today I learned my own son is a fool. By the time I graduated from high school, my father had already filed for bankruptcy 3 different times. Even so, my parents kept pretending they were successful. They rented luxury apartments they couldn't afford, spent money they didn't have, and flooded Facebook with carefully staged photos designed to make everyone think they were living the dream. My younger sister, Sophie, grew up completely surrounded by that fantasy, and over time she turned their worst habits into her own personality. She was 6 years younger than me, and by the time she turned 17, her sense of entitlement had become unbearable. One winter break during college, I came home and found the entire house in chaos. Grandma's pearl necklaces had disappeared. They weren't worth millions, but they'd been passed down through the family since the 1930s and meant more to Grandma than almost anything she owned. Sophie had secretly taken 2 of them from Grandma's vanity, pawned them for $600, and used the cash to buy a VIP pass to a music festival. When Grandma realized they were missing, Sophie immediately burst into tears and pointed the finger at me. She claimed she'd seen me snooping around the bedroom. Without asking a single question, my parents instantly defended her. "Daniel's in college," Dad said. "He probably needed beer money." Grandpa refused to believe it. He quietly drove to every pawn shop in the area until he finally found the necklaces along with the pawn receipt, complete with Sophie's fake ID signature. The truth couldn't be denied anymore. Even then, my parents still refused to hold her accountable. "She's just a kid, Edward," my mom argued. She didn't understand what they meant. "Stop being so hard on her." Grandpa paid to get the necklaces back himself. That day, I watched a piece of him break. As my grandparents got older, my parents' behavior stopped being merely annoying and started becoming genuinely disturbing. Around that same time, I was juggling a demanding finance program in college, working a part-time internship, and driving home every chance I got to help take care of the 2 people who had devoted their lives to taking care of me. After that, Dad started calling my grandparents every single week, but he wasn't checking on their health or asking how they were doing. Every conversation somehow turned into questions about their estate plan, their will, or the names of their financial advisors. He always had an angle. He'd say things like, "Those stairs in the brownstone are getting too dangerous for them. They should sell the house and move into assisted living." What he really meant was, sell the house, stick them in the cheapest facility you can find, and keep whatever money is left. Mom wasn't any better. Every few weeks, she'd email me links to assisted living communities with little notes saying, this would probably be much safer for them. I knew exactly what she was trying to accomplish. College was one of the hardest periods of my life. Grandpa developed congestive heart failure, and Grandma began showing the early signs of vascular dementia. I had the chance to study abroad in Dublin, and it would have been an incredible opportunity. But I turned it down without hesitation because I couldn't leave them. Instead, I enrolled at a nearby university so I could stay close to home. Every morning started the same way. My alarm went off at 5:45. I'd organize Grandpa's 12 different medications, make breakfast for both of them, then rush off to class. Around lunchtime, I'd race back home to make sure everything was okay before returning to campus. At night, I'd study at the kitchen table until 2 or sometimes 2:30 in the morning, while keeping one ear open in case Grandma became confused and wandered toward the front door. My social life practically disappeared. Dating became impossible. Most people my age were enjoying college while I was acting as a caregiver. Honestly, I never regretted it. When my own parents walked away from me, my grandparents sacrificed their retirement years to raise me. Taking care of them wasn't a burden. It was simply what family does. You show up when the people you love need you. Graduation day was probably the happiest and saddest day of my life at the same time. The morning was cool, bright, and clear. I hired a medical transport van so Grandpa could attend with his portable oxygen tank. Grandma sat beside him, gently holding his hand. Every now and then, she'd forget why we were there, but each time she looked at me, her face lit up with pride. As for my parents and Sophie, they never showed. Months earlier, they'd promised they'd be there. Then at 7:10 that morning, Mom sent me a text saying, "Car trouble, we're so sorry. We're incredibly proud of you. We'll celebrate soon." The next day, I found Sophie's Instagram story. They'd spent the weekend at a casino resort in Vermont. For a few minutes, that hurt more than I care to admit. Then I walked across the stage and looked over at Grandpa Edward. Tears were streaming down his face as he struggled to clap with his frail hands. At that moment, I realized something that changed my life. I didn't need my biological parents. The people who had truly earned that title were already sitting in the audience. Later that evening, after we returned to the brownstone, Grandpa asked me to sit beside him. His breathing had become slow and labored, and every word took effort. He looked me straight in the eye and quietly said, "Your parents are hollow people, Daniel. There's nothing at their center. Don't ever let them hollow you out, too." 5 weeks later, Grandpa Edward passed away peacefully in his sleep. I found him sitting in his favorite armchair in the library with an open book resting on his lap, looking as though he'd simply drifted off for an afternoon nap. I've never experienced pain like that before or since. It felt like the foundation beneath my entire life had suddenly disappeared. Exactly 6 months later, Grandma Margaret followed him. The doctors blamed dementia and her rapid decline, but deep down, I know the real reason. She died of a broken heart. She simply didn't want to live in a world without Edward. A few days before she passed, during one of the rare moments when her mind was completely clear, she grabbed my hand with surprising strength. Her eyes locked onto mine, perfectly focused. "Daniel," she whispered. I leaned closer as tears rolled down my face. Edward and I fixed everything. We protected the house. We protected the future. They can't touch it. Promise me you won't ever let them touch it. Sobbing beside her bed, I gave her my word. 4 days later, she was gone. The funeral turned into an absolute circus. Dad and Sophie showed up wearing expensive black clothes, acting like the grieving family everyone expected to see. Dad spent more time introducing himself to my grandparents' friends than actually mourning. He walked around shaking hands like a politician running for office while casually asking people if they knew when the reading of the will was scheduled. What Gregory, Diane, and Sophie didn't know was that my grandparents and I had already been preparing for this moment for over a year. During one of Grandpa's hospital stays, he asked his estate attorney, Rebecca, to come meet with us. Rebecca was brilliant, relentless, and completely fearless. Together, we created the Edward and Margaret Whitmore Family Trust. Every single asset was transferred into it. The brownstone, the Medford triple-decker, the Newton townhouse, every investment account, every bank account, everything. I was named the sole trustee, giving me complete legal authority over every asset inside the trust. The documents also included a specific clause explaining that my parents and sister were intentionally excluded because of their long history of financially exploiting my grandparents. Rebecca looked me in the eye after everything was signed and smiled. "This trust is bulletproof," she said. "If they try to challenge it in probate court, they'll be laughed out of the courtroom." A few days after the funeral, my parents demanded a meeting with Rebecca. She calmly explained that every asset belonged to the private trust and that none of them were beneficiaries. The explosion that followed was unbelievable. Dad's face turned bright purple as he screamed that I'd manipulated a dying old man into giving me everything. Mom grabbed a glass of water and threw it against the wall. Sophie stood there yelling that I was a thief and that she'd sue me until she got what she called her fair share. Rebecca never even flinched. She quietly looked over the top of her glasses and told them they had one opportunity to leave voluntarily before she called building security. They kept screaming. She picked up the phone. Security escorted all three of them out of the building. Unfortunately, that wasn't the end of it. After my grandparents passed away, I was living alone in the brownstone while trying to rebuild my life. I was working full-time in finance, grieving the loss of the two people who had raised me, and doing my best to move forward. My parents made that nearly impossible. Every single day, my phone would blow up. Dad constantly sent threatening text messages about taking me to court. Mom left endless voicemails crying about how they were about to lose their home and begging me to at least give them one of the rental properties. Sophie took things even further. More than once, she showed up at my house late at night, pounding on the front door and screaming that I was stealing what she called the family's generational wealth. Thankfully, my best friend Nathan, who happened to be a real estate attorney, gave me one piece of advice that ended up saving me: document everything. So I did. I saved every text message, every voicemail, every email, and every Ring camera recording of Sophie standing on my porch, screaming like a maniac. About 6 weeks later, everything suddenly went quiet. No phone calls, no text messages, no surprise visits. Looking back, I should have known better. Con artists don't go silent because they've given up. They go silent because they're planning something even bigger. A few weeks later, I had to travel to Denver for a 4-day financial conference. By the time I flew back to Baltimore on Friday afternoon, I was exhausted. I grabbed an Uber from the airport, hauled my suitcase up the brick steps toward the brownstone, and immediately froze. Sitting on my front porch were my father and Sophie, casually drinking lemonade like they owned the place. Both of them wore the same smug, victorious grin that instantly made my stomach tighten. Dad slowly stood up, stretched out his arms, and smiled. "Welcome home, Daniel," he said. Then he laughed. "Actually, I guess I should say welcome to our home." For a few seconds, I couldn't even process what I was hearing. "What the hell are you talking about, Gregory?" Before he could answer, my mother stepped out onto the porch laughing. "We know all about the trust, sweetheart," she said. "But trust can be undone when the trustee's fraud is discovered. We've already taken care of everything." Sophie reached into her expensive designer handbag, pulled out a thick manila folder, and tossed it onto the patio table. "We transferred the deed," she said proudly. A judge agreed the trust was fraudulent. The house is in Dad's name now. It's already been filed with the county. You've got until next Friday to pack your stuff and leave because we're moving in." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I opened the folder. Inside was a photocopy of a quitclaim deed showing ownership of the brownstones supposedly being transferred from the Whitmore family trust to Gregory Whitmore. At the bottom was my signature, or at least something that looked close enough to fool someone who didn't know better. Right beside it sat a notarized seal. The only problem? I'd never signed that document in my life. "This is a forgery," I said as calmly as I could. "You forged my signature." Dad stepped right into my personal space with a smug grin. "Prove it. It's already filed with the county registry. It's public record now, son. That house belongs to me. It always should have belonged to me. If you're still here next Friday, I'll have the police remove you for trespassing." Then they turned around and walked away. As Sophie passed me, she deliberately slammed her shoulder into mine and laughed. "Enjoy living on the street, loser." The strange thing was, I didn't panic. I quietly walked inside, locked the front door, and immediately called Rebecca and Nathan. First thing Monday morning, Nathan and I went straight to the county registry of deeds to pull the official records ourselves. Sure enough, there it was. A quitclaim deed had been officially recorded the previous Wednesday. At first glance, the signature looked surprisingly convincing, but Nathan noticed something almost immediately. The notary stamp belonged to a notary whose commission had expired 4 years earlier. He looked at me with a huge grin. "Daniel, these idiots didn't just forge your signature. They filed forged documents with the county. That's felony forgery, filing false instruments, real estate fraud." Then he kept digging through the public records. Suddenly, all the color disappeared from his face. "Oh my God. What?" I asked. He opened another filing connected to the deed. My parents hadn't stolen the brownstone because they wanted somewhere to live. They'd used it as collateral. The very same day they recorded the fake deed, Dad borrowed $310,000 through a hard money bridge loan from a private lender, using my grandparents' house as security. I felt physically sick. They already cashed out. Nathan slowly nodded. It's even worse than that. They committed wire fraud. They committed bank fraud. They borrowed more than $300,000 against property they don't legally own. And they did it using forged legal documents. He looked me dead in the eyes. This isn't just a civil lawsuit anymore. This is federal-level criminal fraud. We left immediately and drove straight to Rebecca's office. She didn't waste a single minute. First, she filed an emergency LIS pendants to freeze the property's title. Then she requested an injunction to invalidate the fraudulent deed before anyone could transfer or sell the property. After that, she called one of her contacts in the Baltimore Police Department's white-collar crime unit. Over the next 2 days, we handed investigators everything. The original trust documents, verified samples of my real signature, ring camera footage of Dad threatening me, copies of the fake deed, loan paperwork showing the fraudulent bridge loan. Every piece of evidence fit together perfectly. The detectives could hardly believe how obvious it all was. Rebecca actually laughed at one point and said she'd rarely seen criminals leave behind such a complete paper trail. Late Wednesday evening, Dad sent me one final text. "The movers will be there tomorrow morning at exactly 9:15. Have your boxes sitting on the curb or we'll throw everything away." I stared at the message for a few seconds before smiling. Then I typed my reply. "Understood. See you at 9:15. Thursday morning had finally arrived. Everything my family had put me through over the last 25 years was about to come crashing down. I woke up at 5:20 a.m., walked downstairs into the kitchen, and made a fresh pot of Grandma Margaret's favorite coffee. For the next 9 months after my grandparents passed away, the harassment never stopped. I sat in Grandpa Edward's favorite chair in the library with the old chessboard sitting in front of me. I kept hearing his voice in my head. "Always think 4 moves ahead. Protect your king." That's exactly what I'd done. Rebecca and Nathan arrived at my house around 8:15 that morning. By 8:50, an unmarked police SUV quietly pulled into the alley behind the brownstone where it couldn't be seen from the street. 2 detectives from the fraud unit were already sitting in my kitchen, drinking coffee and casually talking baseball while they waited. At exactly 9:15, a large moving truck rumbled down the narrow historic street, carefully squeezing between the parked cars before stopping in front of my house. Right behind it pulled Dad's freshly leased Mercedes, almost certainly paid for with the fraudulent $310,000 bridge loan. My parents climbed out looking like they were headed to a celebration instead of a crime scene. Mom wore oversized designer sunglasses. Dad had a cigar hanging from the corner of his mouth. Sophie was already filming everything on her phone, probably planning to post my humiliation online. 3 movers jumped out of the truck, lowered the loading ramp, and waited for instruction. Dad marched up the brick steps and pounded on my front door. "Time's up, Daniel. Let's get this over with." I opened the door and stepped onto the porch holding nothing but a mug of coffee. I hadn't packed a single box. Dad's confident smile immediately started to fade. Where's your stuff? He snapped. I told you if it wasn't packed, the movers were throwing everything out. I calmly took another sip of coffee. I'm not going anywhere, Gregory. Mom laughed from the bottom of the steps. Don't make this more difficult than it has to be, Daniel. We own this house now. We have the deed. Just then, Rebecca stepped out beside me, carrying a briefcase and dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. You mean the forged quitclaim deed? She asked. A second later, Nathan walked out and stood on my other side. Dad's face tightened. Who the hell are you people? Rebecca didn't even blink. My name is Rebecca Bennett. I'm legal counsel for the Whitmore Family Trust. This is Nathan Cole, Daniel's attorney. We're here to inform you that your fraudulent deed was declared void under an emergency court order signed at 8:05 this morning. Sophie slowly lowered her phone. Dad, what's she talking about? Dad tried to sound confident, but his voice shook. You can't do that. A judge already approved everything. I have rights. I'm his son. Nathan smiled. No judge approved your forgery. You forged Daniel's signature, used a notary whose commission expired years ago, and filed a fraudulent deed with the county. Mom immediately screamed loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. We didn't forge anything. He signed it. He's lying. I looked at her and quietly replied, that's going to be difficult to prove, especially since you used that fake deed to secure a $310,000 bridge loan from Summit Lending. I looked directly at my father. So, where's the money, Gregory? Every bit of color disappeared from his face. For a second, I honestly thought he was going to collapse right there on the front steps. Mom slowly turned toward him. Gregory, what bridge loan? She had no idea. He'd forged the deed, borrowed over $300,000 against a house he didn't own, and hidden every bit of it from his own wife. Rebecca smiled. Oh, it gets even better. You didn't just commit real estate fraud. You used forged documents to obtain money from a federally regulated financial institution through interstate wire transfers. Congratulations. You've upgraded this into federal wire fraud and bank fraud. Dad stumbled backwards so fast he nearly fell down the steps. He turned toward the movers and shouted, Forget it! Pack up! Everybody leave! Right now! A calm voice came from inside the house. I'm afraid nobody's going anywhere. The two fraud investigators calmly walked out onto the porch, badges clipped to their belts. I've never seen another human being completely deflate the way my father did in that moment. His knees actually buckled. The cigar slipped from his mouth, bounced down the brick steps, and rolled into the street. One detective stepped forward. Gregory Whitmore. Diane Whitmore. You're both under arrest for forgery, filing false legal documents, and real estate fraud. Then he looked directly at my father. And, Mr. Whitmore, we also have a warrant regarding the fraudulent procurement of a $310,000 loan. The movers looked at each other, realized they'd accidentally shown up in the middle of a felony investigation, threw their hands in the air, sprinted back to their truck, and drove away without saying a single word. Mom completely lost it. She started hyperventilating before immediately throwing Dad under the bus. No, I didn't know about the loan. I only signed the paperwork because he told me to. I didn't know. The officers handcuffed Dad first. He didn't argue. He didn't resist. He just stared at the ground like his entire world had collapsed. A few seconds later, they handcuffed Mom. As she cried uncontrollably, her expensive sunglasses fell onto the brick walkway and shattered. Then there was Sophie. She stood beside the Mercedes, shaking so hard she could barely hold onto her phone. Finally, she yelled, Wait, what about me? My stuff's still at their apartment. Where am I supposed to go? One of the investigators looked at her. Are you Sophie Whitmore? Yes. We have evidence showing you were present when the fraudulent notary stamp was obtained. You're not under arrest today, but we strongly recommend you don't leave the state. We'll be contacting you. As the SUV doors closed, Dad looked out the window one last time. There wasn't any anger left in his eyes. No hatred. No arrogance. Only fear. I looked over at Sophie and smiled. Enjoy the street, loser. I was simply repeating the exact words she'd said to me the week before. Then I turned around, walked back into the brownstone, and quietly closed the heavy oak door. The months that followed were a blur. Because the evidence against them was overwhelming, everything moved through the legal system surprisingly fast. Investigators eventually traced the missing $310,000 to a cryptocurrency wallet Dad had secretly created. Since he had access to that money and was considered a serious flight risk, the judge denied him bail. He's now facing up to 18 years in federal prison. Mom accepted a plea agreement and testified against him, but she's still expected to serve between 4 and 6 years for her role in the forgery. After my parents defaulted on the fraudulent bridge loan, the private lender seized every asset they owned, their bank accounts, their personal property, even the Mercedes. Everything was gone. About 5 weeks ago, Sophie called me crying. She told me she was sleeping on a friend's couch and desperately needed money to pay her rent. I reminded her of one of Grandpa Edward's favorite lessons. People who rush never think 4 moves ahead. Then I hung up. After that, I blocked her number. These days, the brownstone is peaceful again. Sometimes I'll sit alone in the library, and for just a moment, I swear I can smell Grandma Margaret's cinnamon rolls drifting through the house, or hear Grandpa gently setting chess pieces onto the board. Maybe it's just my imagination. Maybe it isn't. Last week, Rebecca and I finally completed something we'd been planning for months. Using part of the income from the Medford rental properties, we officially established the Edward and Margaret Whitmore Foundation. The foundation provides full college scholarships and financial literacy mentoring for young adults aging out of Baltimore's foster care system. Kids who don't have parents they can depend on. Kids who deserve someone like Grandpa Edward and Grandma Margaret in their corner. My parents spent most of their lives trying to steal wealth they never earned. In the end, their own greed handed me everything I needed to stop them forever. And the best part? They never saw it coming.